So there, we hear about endless challenges, right? But we're also seeing that there's also been tremendous progress being made just over the past decade, not only on the very small scale of conferences and talking about what's going on, but also the fact that we also see unions across countries, across the United States, across Western Europe, in Africa, in developing countries, all talking about the climate crisis, all talking about ways to try and solve it. The fact that we're seeing more and more policy development, whether it's from IRENA, whether it's from the International Energy Association, talking about what the plans are, how much GHGs do we have to reduce, how quickly, how do we have to transition our industries, how do we transition our energy systems, how do we transition our transport systems. All of this is moving forward. So currently I'm working with Ian, as well as with Mathieu, and as well as with Gregor. And one of the projects we're working on is here with Canada, with 3 major private sector industrial unions, Unifor, USW, and CSN FIM. And they all are engaged in these kinds of issues. Some are leading. Unifor, interestingly enough, has been able to negotiate gas plants, battery transitions for EV and battery plants at some of its automaking facilities. It's running into problems, but yet, as we heard yesterday from Angelo, it did have broad backing from the members about how to try and move this forward. Got the battery plants there, the jobs are going to be there, going to be unionized jobs. That's one side. The other side, as we just heard yesterday from the USW, is that they're still thinking, we don't know, members aren't even involved, right? We don't know what the debate is. We need industrial policy. We're not even there, right? The same, right? So that's another side to it. On the other side is that they're still thinking, yes, this is something that's important. It's a priority for us. It's a priority for our national federations, our provincial federations. Climate is now on the agenda for labor as it was not 5 years ago. So these kinds of transformations have taken place enormously, and we have to begin to think about how do we connect the dots, as Philip put it. How do we think about what's happening in terms of unions? How do we think about what's happening in terms of those countries? How do we think about what's happening in terms of politics and policy? And I sort of come at this in a couple of different ways. One, I'm a former trade unionist. I'm a former pipeline construction worker. I did that for 10 to 15 years. It was a family trade. For 50 years for my father. It was a family trade for my brother for more than 20 years. It was a trade for me for 15 years, right? So I pipelined all across terrible places in Western Canada, some beautiful, but in terrible weather conditions, right? Doing all these kinds of things. But even in those kinds of situations, my brother has quit the trade because it's not only terrible for the environment, but it's terrible work, even though it's unionized work. My father, after 50 years, has now said, you know what, we may have to do something that's going to be better for our planet because this is not the way we should be going, right? So that you do see these kinds of shifts. So how do we put a framework together, right? How do we think about why a comparative framework of these different kinds of events, these different kinds of progress that's being made? How do we put it together so that we can understand where and how unions actually can begin to make steps forward? Not only that, not only how they're taking steps forward, but why they're able to take those steps forward. And not only that, I think the other thing is that we're seeing a variety of successes moving forward, but we don't know how to move it to the next level. And this is why I would say that if we want to use some sort of sense about movement, about understanding how politics does develop, we should maybe take a look at social movement theory. I'm just throwing it out there, but this is sort of one way to say we have to look at what are the material interests for unions, what are they sort of facing? We have to look at the resources of unions and labor movements, and we have to begin to think about the politics and the political dynamics as well as the political opportunities that exist to be able to take these interests forward. So if we do this, then I think we have a sort of a way to be not only connect the dots, but somehow also to get a sense about what the different kinds of strategies are and how we can sort of continue to assess about whether we're making progress or whether we're not making progress. And especially, I think this is tremendously important because as every scientific and every policy institute comes out and tells us, we're looking at, a deadline of 5 years before we get into major climate and environmental problems that we're going to pass 1.5 in the next 5 to 6 years. We're going to pass 2 degrees by mid-century. We're looking at massive kinds of environmental collapse. So having a sense about how to connect those dots and why and how different strategies might work, I think is critical, not only for us as researchers, but I think for our planet, I think for our trade union movements, as well as for our public policy as well. So if we can do that, we can move on in terms of social movement theory. So I think we can move it. Just I'm going to very briefly say, why do we need some sort of sense about labor's varieties, strategies on climate? Well, I don't think we necessarily have one yet. Labor environmentalism has been looking at case studies, looking at how the problems are, all the kinds of constraints that have labor in terms of sort of moving forward on issues. Our sense about varieties of unionism or varieties of capitalism. Well, I don't think, as Gregor has pointed out, with hybrid experimentalism going on, you can't simply use to say, well, it's all just going to happen in the social democratic countries and it's not going to happen anywhere else. Well, that's simply not the case, right? The Climate Jobs Coalition and the Climate Jobs National Resource Center that's come out of the States, who would have expected, right, that it's the United States that's been sort of leading in terms of innovation, in terms of labor and climate coalitions suddenly emerging there, but not only emerging in one state, but now being taken and scaled up across the country in many states and new kinds of coalitions. So I think we have a sense about what some of the problems are. And I think this is all the sort of research that we're hearing. And we know what some of those things are, but we have to begin to think about not so much the how, but why, right? What accounts for these kinds of varieties? What accounts for the different kinds of strategies that are going forward? And a social movement theory that looks at policy and justice and democracy as this always contested processes of our societies, right, over the last century, puts the sort of sense that it's not only a dynamic thing, but it's how organized power interests are fighting over these basic kinds of concepts of equality, of sustainability, of democracy, of what we need to actually have a good life and a good world. So that's, I think, sort of key to sort of begin to think about that sort of thing. Yes, we know, I think, as Matt Huber has really demonstrated for all of us who've read that, the climate crisis is a class problem, right? Those who are paying the price are workers. They are workers' communities. It doesn't matter where you're looking at this, right? It's about people's just general quality of life and their general basic social security and economic security. Extreme weather poses major disruptions to work through unemployment, rebuilding, heat stress. Pollution creates premature deaths, waste and environmental damage, as well as the fossil fuel energy consumption. As he notes, creates a huge cost of living crisis, right? It's not necessarily due to governments trying to put more money into the economy. It's the fact that they've allowed major oil and gas companies to make huge amounts of profits that is now driving our inflation around. And as he points out, unless we begin to figure out how to drive those strategies forward, there's no jobs on a dead planet. That makes it a true working class issue. And I think this is why he makes that a very convincing argument that workers have so much to gain from a progressive climate program. But as we all know from our own experience, as well as everywhere we hear about what's happening elsewhere, the climate crisis is still just one issue among every other issue that workers and unions and labor movements are dealing with. It job loss, worsening wages, cost of living, health crises, right? So in some sense, it's just one among many, and it might be a sort of hypothetical depending upon where you live and your geography, right? But I think when we sort of look at that, right, we have to say that's just how the material interest is, right? Workers are stuck, right, in terms of what their wages and work are, right? They want better ones, but they're also facing a climate crisis that could make it even worse, right? So we have to just simply accept that's the general contradiction of our life in terms of trying to sort of address this. But I think which is important, right, is to say that when we think about the fossil fuel industry and the transition, or we think about the oil and gas and jobs versus the environment issue, we shouldn't blow it out of proportion, okay? Oil and gas industries are only huge in a very limited number of countries, right? Even in Canada, which is the 6th largest fossil fuel oil and gas producer in the world, the number of employed in the labor force is 3/4. We think that this is a massive transition in terms of our labor markets. It's not. Just the churn on an annual basis is about 1 to 1.5% in terms of labor market turnover, right? So if that's the case, how can't we, right, think about these kinds of transitions over a 10-year period, right? So even in a fossil fuel driven country, right, you can think about how you'd be able to make that transition a reality. But saying that it's a problem that can be managed is also a political problem for trade unions, right? Where you have big fossil fuel gas interests and you have major multinational corporations and you have strong union density in those sectors, it's going to be a political fight that you have to realize and you have to address. Just like we saw in the video that Vivian showed for the Norwegian workers, it's still about oil and gas. For everyone who's, more pipeline colleagues and brothers and sisters out in Western Canada, it's still about fossil fuel jobs, right? Okay. You have to have that hard discussion to say, this is an industry that's going to kill us. I know that you're making $100,000 a year, but we got to be able to think how we can get out of this mess so that we can have better jobs in moving it forward. But that's not the case everywhere, right? And I think we have to put a real political reality on this. New York State doesn't have an oil and gas industry, right? So as a consequence, the workers say, okay, well, we can make a move, right? We can make it and make that a reality for us. Extreme weather and union mobilization, I think it's critical. I think what we're seeing now, as we've seen the increasing numbers of floods, of storms, of droughts, of hurricanes, right, and what it actually means for people, I think this is a mobilizing tool, and it's not only a sort of a tool, but it's a wake-up call. It's a wake-up check for unions and for workers everywhere. When you see those things actually hit your community, hit your families, hit your extended families, hit your neighbors, hit your fellow unions, you understand that this is something that you may have to begin to sort of deal with. That is the wild card. And it's not just a wild card anymore. It's a major problem hitting countries everywhere, right? And it makes it real, right? Okay, in terms of how to that. But I think we have to be aware that in countries where you're getting hit, it's much more likely, I think, that unions and workers and labor movements and political parties are going to be able to advance on those kinds of issues, saying, we've just had a crisis, we have to be able to begin to address it. Unions and the resources. Well, there's been all kinds of discussion here over the past day and a bit, and I'm already at 2 minutes. Oh, Jesus, I'm going to need a few more than that. There's no question if you got a stronger union movement and you got a stronger labor movement, you can deal with more issues, right? You can deal with the multiple issues coming at you, right? You have more capacities for knowledge, you have more capacities for education, you have more capacities for public awareness, you got more capacities for political action, right? But the simple fact is that unless unions, right, are actually stepping out of their comfort zone and moving into coalition or extending an olive branch or getting information, working with environmental coalitions as they are with the Climate Jobs National Resource Center, or as 3F in Denmark currently works with the Workers' Federation, as well as with environmental consultants, or as IG Metall has used Hans Bockler, as well as their own consultants to draw out an actual plan for the transition of those industries. Unions need the knowledge first, and the stronger unions can do that. But even in cases where, right, you do have unions don't necessarily have all the resources, they can still go out and reach it, and they can still be able to move that plan. But they need to have that kind of network. They have to have that kind of information. They have to be able to do the sort of basic reach out to be able to move issues kinds of forwards. So density matters, but it matters most of all in those key sectors, whether it's in renewable energy, transit, manufacturing, and construction, right? Those are the ones that are going to be the sunrise industries. Those are going to be the green industries. That's where unions have to be able to do that reach out. That's where they can be able to make those kinds of cases. This is not about just jobs that we're going to lose. It's going to be about the new jobs we can get. And the better that you're deeply embedded with some of those environmental coalitions, and the better that you can create other coalitions with other unions, the more that I think you can be able to see movements forward. And if you can even take the next step and say that this isn't just a union issue, this is a community issue, this is our family's issue, right? This is our children's issue, this is a national issue, then you can say, not only do we need these jobs for ourselves, we need these better jobs for everybody, and we need better labor protection, and we need better training for everyone. And I think this is one of the sort of keys about trying to make this a reality, is that labor rights are human rights. And I think sometimes we forget to be able to make that case, and only in some cases where this is made that we see the most sort of success going forward. Lots of things about political opportunities, and social movements go on about this. Yes, I know I'm already out, right? Okay, but I'm sure, like, this is the last one. Well, this is the last session. What else do we got to go to here? we have nothing but problems before us. And we think, oh my God, how are we going to deal with Trump? Okay. How are we going to deal with Pierre Poilievre? And how are we going to deal with Macron? Right. All of these things, right, seem like they're impossible. Okay. Well, the fact I think is the struggle is just about everywhere is that it's capital versus everybody else. And that capital has realized it's going to cost cash to be able to get out of the climate crisis, and capital everywhere is going to do any and everything to make sure that that transition doesn't happen. And capital everywhere needs that it's going to be minority rule to make this happen. And to do that, you are outsourcing all of your political mobilization on the basis of racism, right? On the basis of anti-immigration, usually on the basis to some sort of Christian network, or in Western Europe to Nazis now and to right-wingers, right? And you mobilize on that basis, and you try to then take advantage that you have some sort of minority support to be able to push your agenda forward. But that doesn't mean that if it's only minority support, people and workers still have the majority. But they have to be able to realize that it's not the idea that it's all white workers are suddenly racist or they're suddenly anti-immigrant. The fact is that's constructed by media organizations, by political mobilizations, and by the rich throwing in millions of dollars to try and sway people, right? And I think if we realize that we need to get out a different narrative and that we have to, right, make sure that we have the same kind of mass media presence, we can be able to sort of push back that in a very substantive way. Yes. Okay, two more. Yeah, these are the last two, and then I'll go right to the conclusion. So yes, I know we've got half an hour. We got 15 minutes. Okay. Unions and labor movements, though, are still in quiet politics on this. Apart from the Green New Deal, right, and apart from the European Green Deal, we haven't seen unions be able to take this up and notch it up. And I think that's just because it's still developing. But unless labor movements think about how they're going to maximize and scale up these issues of climate and labor, right, you're going to be on the losing end. You have to be able to win this in political debate. You have to be able to win this in politics. You have to get it into the public consciousness. And I think this is tremendously important. Two more things. We have to also be aware that not in every country are countries, right, have the policies that are engaging unions. This is certainly the case, I think, for Quebec perfectly, right? That you do not have the industrial policies. They're not talking about the trade policies. They're not talking about the phase-out policies or the phase-in policies. Public policy matters to get people's attention, and that's certainly the case for unions. If you don't have transition policies, why should the steelworkers here begin to care about it, or why should their members care about it, right? So policy development and what the context is critical for beginning to sort of think about this. Yes, there's issues about just transition. Here's our ideal type. I just want to make very quickly, there's not just one ideal type. There's many ways that we can begin to think about it, but we do have to think about what the material interests are. What are the union resources? What are the opportunities? And to think that there's many different kinds of ways that those can be realized, right? It doesn't require everything, but we do need to have a good organizer's sense that there are hammers that we need to have to be able to move the thing forward. Not everyone is going to have social partnership, okay? But what you might have, right, is the ability to put a labor coalition that puts environment and climate jobs at the center. And if you do that, then you can also begin to think about how you can then build that and scale that over time. Because if we're not just thinking about strategies, it also has to be about what are we doing over time to be able to move that needle.